Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Justin, for the introduction. Good evening. We appreciate you, like Justin said, we really appreciate you being here tonight. Hopefully our presentation is informative and you start getting a lot of your questions answered. And hopefully through the Q&A, we'll be able to answer a lot of those questions. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I will be presenting the alternatives that have been developed as part of this EIS impact statement. But I wanted to, before I jumped into all the different alternatives that we've developed, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about how these alternatives were developed, how we're going to analyze these different alternatives, and just talk about, in general, why we're looking at so many different alternatives. To begin with, I wanted to start with the project purpose and our purpose statement, as I'm showing up here on this slide. Probably the purpose statement is a pretty important place to start in the environmental process, in that it defines high level the goals of the project. It also helps us set a foundation for the alternatives that we're looking at, as well as provides a framework on how we evaluate each of the alternatives. For this project, the key driver is congestion on US 40. Today, we're seeing a fair amount of congestion on US 40. We expect that the congestion will continue to get worse as growth continues to happen in the Heber Valley and the Wasatch County area. So the purpose of this project is really framed around improving the mobility on US 40, as you can see in our statement here. Another key statement another phrase that we've added to this statement that may be new to some of you is that we've recently added a statement that where we're looking for this project to provide opportunities for non-motorized transportation. You may recall last spring, UDOT published our draft purpose statement for the public and agencies to comment on. Based on those comments we received, UDOT decided that we wanted to add a non-motorized transportation component to our primary purpose statement. What this basically does is it allows us to the final alternatives that we'll be looking at will include features that would help provide opportunities for people who are not using motorized vehicles. So we'll be looking at adding bike lanes or multi-use trails into the final alternatives that we'll be evaluating later on. So that's a new piece that we've added to the purpose statement. And finally, just as the last piece of our purpose statement, we want to make sure that whatever alternatives that we're looking at, that they allow for Heber City to meet the vision for their historic town center, and that we're not doing anything that would preclude them from being able to implement their vision. So that's kind of a high level on our project purpose. Next, I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about how our alternatives were developed for this project. First of all, we want to make sure that the alternatives that we develop address the project purpose that I just just talked about, and specifically that the alternatives address making improvements to the mobility on US 40. Each of these alternatives have come from a variety of sources. Some of them have come from previous studies, some of the previous planning studies that have been done. Some of these alternatives have also come from some of the traffic analysis that we've done in our team. And some of the alternatives have come from comments that we have received from the public as well. We recognize that there are a number of ways that we can improve mobility on US 40. One of those ways is we can make improvements directly to US 40. And we have a number of alternatives that I'll be showing here in a few minutes that do that. Another way that we can make those improvements to US 40 is by building bypasses and then rerouting or routing traffic from US 40 onto those bypasses. And so I'll be showing alternatives that look at bypasses that are on the west side. We have also developed some alternatives that look at bypasses on the east side of US 40 as well. And then also we recognize that another way to improve the mobility on US 40 to meet those project goals is through transit. And so these are the different types of alternatives that we'll be looking at. Each of these alternatives that we've developed are high level. They're conceptual at this stage. And so as you look at these alternatives, recognize that they are very high level, and we recognize that as you look at these alternatives that you're going to have concerns, and that's to be expected. But we want you to know that we are following the NEPA process that requires us to look at a lot of alternatives. I know back in the scoping phase of the project, we were asked to take a step back and make sure that we took a look at all the alternatives, and that's what we're doing. We've taken a step back and we are considering all the alternatives as the NEPA process requires. And as we follow the NEPA process, we believe that we'll be able to, that it will help us to make good decisions. And ultimately our goal is to be able to evaluate those alternatives that meet the purpose of the project and are at the least amount of impacts to the environment. Next, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the alternative screening process and the steps that we go through to analyze each of the alternatives. This is a multi-step process, as this diagram here on the left is attempting to show. And as we walk through each of these steps, we begin to screen out the different alternatives. Right now, we are, excuse me, in step 2 of this process. It's to develop conceptual alternatives. That's why we're asking for, that's why we're developing all these alternatives and asking for comments on the alternatives, just to make sure that we're considering everything that's potentially out there that could help solve the problem of congestion on US 40. Once we've gone through this comment period, we'll begin moving down into other screening steps. The next step we would look at is to look at each of the alternatives to see if they are technically feasible and if they meet the goals of the project. Those alternatives that are not technically feasible will get screened out, and then the remaining alternatives will then carry on into the next level of screening, which we call level 1 screening. It's at this stage that we begin to look at how well each of the alternatives meet the purposes of the project. This is a very objective view of analyzing the alternatives. We'll use our traffic modeling to see how well each of these alternatives help to reduce congestion and improve the mobility on US 40. At this stage, we'll also look at how well or whether or not they avoid or minimize impacts to the historic buildings on Main Street. And we'll also look for ways that these alternatives can provide the opportunities for the non-motorized transportation components as well. Any alternatives that do not meet the purpose and need will get screened out, will be eliminated from the alternatives. Next, we'll do some preliminary engineering. We'll develop a footprint for each of the remaining alternatives, and then we'll move into our level 2 screening. It's at the level 2 screening level where we begin to look at impacts to each of the alternatives. We'll be looking at impacts to some of our key resources. Some of those are our Section 4F resources like public parks and historic buildings. Other alternatives, other resources that we'll look at for impacts on would be wetlands. It's also at this stage where we'll begin to look at impacts to public or to properties. We'll look at some of those right-of-way impacts, and we'll also be developing a high-level cost for each one of the alternatives as well. Any of the alternatives that do not meet any alternative any alternatives that perform similarly with regards to purpose but have high impacts, those are the alternatives that we will at this stage screen out and eliminate from the process. So once we get through all these steps, we expect that we will be down to just a handful of alternatives that we'll then be able to further refine, and it's these alternatives that we will then take into a detailed alternatives evaluation in the draft environmental impact statement. It's at this stage where we'll further look at the impacts, especially the impacts to community resources. So we would be looking at this stage, we'd be looking at noise impacts or visual impacts. We'd also be looking at recreation resources as well, such as private subdivision parks and those kinds of things. So hopefully at this stage, we get a feel for how we go through the alternative screening process. There's a lot of information here, and it's fairly complicated. So I'd really encourage you to take some time to study this as you're looking at all the alternatives. That you also take time to study and understand how we go through and evaluate each of the alternatives. And if you have questions or comments on those, feel free to please let us know, and so we can get those comments and help answer those questions. So with that, I'm going to now launch into describing the various alternatives that have so far been developed with the project. As I alluded to earlier, we do have several groups of alternatives. The first group of alternatives that we're going to look at are those associated with US 40, making improvements directly to US 40. There are currently 6 alternatives concepts that would improve US 40. We've named each of these concepts 40A through 40E. The 40 in the alternatives name indicates the improvements that we are making on US 40. All 6 of these alternatives are shown in this figure. We wanted to highlight, wanted to use this figure to highlight the different concepts, the different the differences and the similarities associated with each of these alternatives. But I'll be going through each one of these alternatives individually in the following slides. Just to help you get oriented to this figure, north is pointing to the right towards Park City. Just as a high level comparison, all 6 of these alternatives start at about 500 North and Main Street and continue down through Main Street through downtown Heber and terminate here at about 1200 South. We've also included in this alternative different intersection improvements as well, and we've highlighted those with these little circles and diamonds or triangles. Sorry. In addition, we've also shown on this particular figure the various key resources that we're looking at as well in this initial alternatives analysis. So we've highlighted our wetlands, which are in green. We've highlighted some of the public parks in yellow, and then we also have red dots, which highlight the historic homes. And each of these resources are other resources that will be used in our screening process. So the first alternative that we'll be looking at for US 40 is a widening of US 40. This concept would improve the mobility on US 40 by adding lanes to Main Street through the downtown Heber area from the 500 North down to the 1200 South area. Right now, US 40 has 2 lanes in each direction with a center turn lane for a total of 5 lanes, which we've depicted in this typical section here on the lower right. This alternative would add an additional lane, one for northbound, one for southbound, for a total of 7 lanes. Right now, we don't know how that widening would happen. We could be widening to the west, or widening to the east, or splitting the difference, and we'll figure that out as we go down, as we work through the process. Our next alternative is alternative 40B, which and for the next few alternatives, we're going to be looking at making improvements to the intersections of US 40. All the intersections on US 40 are expected to operate at failing conditions in the PM peak hour by 2050 if no improvements are made. So this concept would improve mobility on US 40 by making improvements to the intersections. This particular alternative does that by adding roundabouts to all the signalized intersections, and we're showing each of those with these green dots here on the graphic. With this alternative, we would not be adding any lanes to US 40, except we do expect to see that widening at the intersections where these roundabouts are added. But we wouldn't see any widening necessarily on the lanes themselves. So our next alternative is alternative 40C. With this alternative, we also make improvements to the signalized intersections as well. In this case, the improvements are made by adding turn lanes to each of the intersections. And once again, we've highlighted those intersections where the improvements will be made with these blue triangles. Also, with this alternative, we are proposing that SR 113 would be realigned to tie into Center Street so that the main east-west movements would align at a single intersection. Currently, they're offset. There's an offset between Center Street and 100 South. So with this alternative, the signal at 100 South would no longer be needed. And once again, as we depicted on the cross sections on the right, we would not be adding any additional lanes with this alternative. So the next alternative is our 40D alternative. Another way that we can improve the mobility, the throughput on US 40 is by creating alternatives that would bypass all the intersections, either through the use of a tunnel, which we're showing here, or through the use of a bridge, which we show in this typical here on the lower right side. With this alternative, Main Street would remain a 35-mile-an-hour facility to handle the local traffic at the ground level. And then the through traffic that's moving through Heber City would then be put through either the tunnel or the bridge at a 50-mile-per-hour speed. Okay, our next alternative is 40E. This is a reversible lanes concept. This is another way that we can manage congestion on US 40 through traffic management means. With this alternative, we recognize that that there's a strong directional split with traffic on US 40. During the evening, US 40 experiences a strong southbound direction as people travel from Park City down towards Heber City. We see a similar pattern in the morning as well, where there's more traffic heading northbound from Heber City towards Park City. Reversible lanes are lanes in which traffic can travel in either direction, depending on the time of day. So with this alternative, we would not be adding any additional lanes to US 40, but we would be utilizing the center lane for as the reversible lane. So in the morning, the center lane would be used for northbound traffic during that peak period, and then in the evening, the center lane would be used for the southbound traffic as traffic moves back from Park City towards Heber City. With this alternative, left turns during those peak hours that are currently utilizing Center Street would not be able to be used. With this alternative, we use overhead signs with changeable lane control signals, which would indicate the direction of travel. We use green arrows and red crosses. With these signs, which we're kind of showing here on the right side, these sign gantries, and they would be placed about every 500 to 700 feet along the corridor. That's so that drivers who are driving through here can see at least two of these at any given time. And if you want to see an example of this, there is an example at 5400 South in Salt Lake County, which uses this system. So the last alternative on US 40 is a one-way couplet system. In this concept, that we would propose splitting US 40 into two one-way roads between 500 North to about 1000 South. With Main Street would be for the northbound travel, and 100 West would be for the southbound travel. With this alternative, we would need to widen 100 West, as we show here in this cross section here, to add 3 lanes to this to 100 West. With the US 40, however, we would be able to actually reduce the width of US 40. Once again, taking it down to 3 lanes in the northbound direction. And we kind of show that here in this bottom typical section. So that concludes all of the alternatives for Heber Main Street. Next, we'll look at the west bypass alternatives. With this concept, we have 4 west bypass alternatives to look at. We've labeled these alternatives WA through WD, with the W in the alternative name to indicate a bypass on the west side. The primary difference between each of these alternatives is the speed limit and the number of connections that we make to the local road network. Once again, we're showing all 4 of these alternatives on this figure so that we can highlight the differences and the similarities. But I'll be going through each one of these individually in the following slides. Once again, we've oriented this slide with north pointing to the right towards Park City. A few things I'd like to point out here. First off, 3 of the bypass concepts, WA, WB, and WC, generally follow the corridor that has been preserved by Heber City and Wasatch County, and they all tie back to US 40 at about 800 north. The 4th alternative, WD, extends further north and ties back to US 40 at Potter Lane and at River Road. Also want to point out that 3 of these, the three concepts, WA, WB, and WC, have options that would realign US 189, but I'll first be looking at the option that leaves 189 in its current configuration. So let's look at each one of these. First one we'll look at is what we call alternative WA1. This is our west bypass limited access grade separated alternative. This is the highest speed west bypass alternative with the fewest connections to other roads. So this is basically a 65 mph highway type facility. It's also grade separated, which means that traffic traveling on this bypass would not have to stop for the different crossroads, because we would be bridging across each of the crossroads. Connections to this bypass would be accomplished through interchanges. We have 6 interchanges with this alternative, and we've highlighted those alternatives with these orange circles. Couple things to point out with this alternative. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, this alternative does follow the corridor that was set aside by Heber City and Wasatch County. I also want to point out this gray area in the northwest quadrant here. At this location, because of the number of wetlands that we'll have to analyze and we're required to minimize or avoid, we haven't yet settled on any particular alignment through this area. The other thing I'd like to point out is this connection at 1300 South. This is a key connection for this alternative and the other alternatives that we'll be showing as well. The other 3 alternatives that we'll be showing, in that it draws, with this connection, we're able to draw traffic off of Heber Main Street and onto the bypass. Some of our preliminary analysis shows that these west bypass alternatives don't necessarily meet purpose and need without this connection. And then also with these alternatives, with some of our preliminary analysis, it looks like this bypass alternative would only need one lane in each direction, like we depicted down in this bottom cross section here on the right, with the exception of this segment between SR 113 and 1300 South, where we would need 2 lanes in each direction. So next we'll move to our WB1 option. This one is in terms of the alignment is similar to the previous alignment we just looked at, but with this alignment the speed limit is much slower. This would operate at about a 55 mph speed limit, and with this alternative, we would no longer the intersections would no longer be grade separated. Rather, all the intersections would be at grade intersection, meaning that the traffic that's traveling along the bypass would have to stop at intersections with other roads. With this alternative, we've identified 8 intersections that would intersect the bypass at grade, and we've highlighted those with these blue triangles. Similar to the other alternative, we have the 13th South connection, and also with this alternative, the bypass could operate well with 1 lane in each direction, as we're showing in the cross sections here on the right, with the exception of that segment between SR 113 and 1300 South. The next alternative is our WC1 alternative. This is our west bypass arterial at grade alternative. This is our lowest speed west bypass alternative, and it has the most connections to the local road network, which we once again highlighted with these purple triangles. This alignment, like the previous 2 alternatives, follows the same alignment, but the speed limit here would be at a 45 mph speed limit. And like the other 2 alternatives, this bypass alternative would also function well with just 1 lane in each direction, with exception to the segment here in the middle from 113 to 1300 South, which would still need the 2 lanes in each direction. So I've just reviewed option 1 of the alternatives, which leaves US 189 in its current configuration. We do have an option 2 that goes with each of these alternatives as well, which would realign US 189, like we've shown here in this graphic with this dark red line. With this option, traffic that's traveling north on US 189 would be rerouted to the bypass, and then this segment of US 189 that we're showing, that's this light red, could then be removed. We're looking at this option because it helps take more traffic off of Main Street, in that it would route all this northbound traffic coming from Provo onto the bypass. We know that there's been a lot of comments about the alternative of realigning a portion of US 189 because of railroad, because of the airport expansion. I just want to state that we are not looking at this option because of the airport. Yes, the airport master plan is a separate process, and the decisions that we're making as part of our environmental impact statement are independent of any of the decisions that we would be making, that the airport master plan would be making. So the last alternative that we want to talk about for the West Bypass is what's we call the West Bypass Parkway with turbo roundabouts. Just a quick note that this figure is oriented with north pointing to the right again. This alternative does not completely follow the same alignment as the other previous alternatives that we just looked at. Here on the south end, it follows those alignments, but once we cross SR 113, this alternative would continue further north along 1130 West, and then would connect back to US 40 at Potter Lane and at River Road. The speed limit on this alternative would be 55 miles per hour. This alternative also implements a series of roundabouts called turbo roundabouts. We've highlighted those with these blue circles here in this figure. And just in case you're wondering, turbo roundabouts are a little different than the usual roundabouts that you see around Utah. With a turbo roundabout, these are typically multi-lane roundabouts where the drivers would need to select the proper lane that they enter into, depending on where they want to exit. So the driver therefore wouldn't need to change lanes once they've entered the roundabout. So they're a little more efficient that way and help reduce some of the conflict points. So with that does conclude all of the west bypass alternatives that we're currently looking at. Next, we'll switch to the east alternatives. Currently, we're looking at 3 east bypass alternatives. They're labeled EA, EB, and EC. Once again, we're showing all these concepts in this figure to be able to highlight the similarities and the differences. And I'll be going through each one of these alternatives individually here in a moment. The main difference between these alternatives, once again, is the speed of each of these facilities and how they make connections to the local road network. All of these east bypass alternatives generally follow the Heber City East Bypass roadway that is currently in process of being constructed in this segment north of Center Street. South of Center Street, we do have 2 different alignments. The EA alignment and the EB alignment are parallel 1200 East, but are just east of 1200 East. The third alternative, the EC alternative that we show here, would be on 1200 East. So let's look at each one of these individually. The first one we'll look at is the EA bypass limited access grade separated alternative. This is our highest speed east bypass alternative, and it has the fewest connections to other roads. On this facility, it would also be a 65 mile an hour highway type facility, where there'd be the way you would access this bypass is through interchanges. We have 3 of them identified, which we're showing with these red circles here. This alternative would use the east bypass currently being constructed north of Center Street as much as possible. However, the road that's currently being constructed is at a lower design speed. So as we go around this this curve here, it does diverge from the current alignment that's being built, the current road that's being built. South of Center Street, this alternative would parallel 1200 East. It would be a separate alignment from 1200 East, but would parallel. Preliminarily, we've looked at it. It appears that this alternative would just need to be one lane in each direction, and that would be sufficient for this entire route. The next alternative is the EB alternative, and this is our East Bypass Parkway at grade alternative. This alternative would be at a slower speed at a 55 mile per hour. It would be more of a parkway type facility. With this alternative, the intersections would be at grade intersections. Right now we've identified 7 locations where these at grade intersections would occur, and we've highlighted those with the blue triangles. With this alternative, because of the slower speed, we have less of a divergence from the existing from the current road that's being constructed with this alternative. In this segment north of Center Street. With the segment that's south of Center Street, once again, we follow a new alignment that's east of 1200 East. Preliminarily, it looks like the section that's south of 1200 South at one lane in each direction would be sufficient to carry the traffic in this zone. But once we get north of 1200 South, we would need to go to a 2-lane section, which we show in this cross section here on the upper right. Then our final east bypass alternative is an east bypass arterial at grade alternative. This is our lowest speed east bypass alternative with the most connections to the local road network. With this alternative, the speed limit would be 45 miles per hour. And you can see all the different intersections that would be along this alternative that we've highlighted with the orange triangles. Preliminarily, this alternative would require 2 lanes in each direction for the entire route. It requires more lanes than the previous 2 alternatives because this alternative carries both the local traffic as well as the through traffic, which the other 2 alternatives we had those movements split. So with that, that does get us through all the east alternatives. The last alternative to look at is our transit alternative. Just by way of background, a transit study was prepared in 2020 to develop a vision and an implementation plan for public transportation in the Wasatch County area to address many of the unmet needs there. Some of the recommendations that came out of that study, first was to provide local service within the Heber Valley. Another recommendation was to create a commuter route between Park City and Heber. Another alternative was to create a commuter route between Wasatch County and Utah County. And then there was another recommendation that would create van pool services from Heber City to Orem and to Park City. Our transit alternative concepts are based on these recommendations.